This is the third in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. Why study human nature? Well, it's been said that ignorance of oneself and of others is a chief cause of unhappiness in life. Famous writer Alexander Pope put it this way: the proper study of mankind is man. Among the basic questions I will be dealing with in this series, and indeed have dealt with in part so far, are the following. Which characteristics seem to be common among human beings? In other words, which characteristics, mental and emotional, seem to be typical of human beings? The second question is a scientific one, and one I hope to get to later in this program. The question is, what role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? This, of course, deals with the nature versus nurture controversy. And I'll be talking about two thinkers, both Harvard professors, who very much disagree on the role of environment and genes in human behavior. And those professors are biologist E.O. Wilson and the late zoologist Stephen Jay Gould. The third question I'll be dealing with in this series is this. Given our nature, what tends to satisfy us? What tends to fulfill us? In other words, what's the good life? And finally, the last question. What have famous thinkers suggested can be done to get people to behave more decently towards one another? Let me provide a brief review of the first two segments I've done in this series. I began with the question, which characteristics seem to be common among human beings? And I pointed out that Professor Joseph Campbell provides a good introduction to the answer to this question. Campbell said the following: desire and fear, these are the two emotions by which all life in the world is governed. Yes, we human beings tend to be desirous and fearful. And what are some of the common desires we share? Well, I think it's fair to say most human beings desire pleasure, love, possessions. Many human beings desire status and even power. And what are some of the common fears we share? Well, many people fear death. Many people fear failure. People fear not getting their pleasure. Other people fear that they are frittering away their time in meaningless and hectic activity. And of course, it's not unusual that people fear other people. Besides talking about the idea that human beings by nature are desirous and fearful, I also mentioned that so many of the famous thinkers have commented that human beings are very complicated creatures. And in this context, I quoted Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist. Tolstoy claimed that a mistake people often make in describing other people is attributing some leading characteristic to them. For example, Tolstoy said it's not unusual that some people in describing another person might say, he's wise, or he's foolish, she's kind, or she's unkind, he's lazy, or he's energetic. Tolstoy believes this is this is a mistaken way of evaluating other people. For this reason, and let me quote Tolstoy. Tolstoy said, every man bears within himself the germs of every human quality, displaying all in turn. Socrates, I think, also provides some illumination here. Socrates said, there is much imbalance in all people. Also, in this context of talking about how complicated human beings are, I pointed out that so many of the famous thinkers, for example, Sigmund Freud, said that we human beings tend to be ambivalent creatures. Freud pointed out that it's not unusual that people can both love and hate the same person. And many of the great thinkers have claimed that people are often ambivalent towards life itself, that we can both love life and hate life. And of course, we can be morally ambivalent. Indeed, so many of the great thinkers have said we are morally ambivalent. And what does that mean? Well, I think Pascal, the great French mathematician and philosopher, put it well. Pascal said, and I'm quoting him, "There are two natures in us, the one good, the other bad." Besides being desirous, fearful, and complicated, I pointed out last week that we tend to be mask wearers. At least so many of the great thinkers have said that. Schopenhauer put it this way: we all wear a mask and play a role. And Thoreau said, "And why should I speak to my friends? For how rarely it is that I am I, and are they then they." Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck puts all of this together very neatly, I think. Peck said this: most people opt for lives of very limited honesty and openness and relative closeness, hiding themselves from the world. No discussion of human nature, of course, would be adequate without talking about Sigmund Freud and his attitude towards human nature. And I pointed out last week that Freud had a rather negative view of human nature. He believed that human beings are innately aggressive, that we come out of the womb aggressive. And Freud said this about human beings. He said, and I'm quoting him, "Man is a wolf to man." And Freud used history, among other things, to prove his contention that human beings are constitutionally aggressive towards one another. Indeed, Freud said, the greatest hindrance to civilization is the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. And I gave some examples of this last week. One might use the example of the Nazi Holocaust to show how aggressive people can be towards other people. More recently, there have been genocides in Rwanda, the Balkans, and presently in the Darfur area of Africa. Also, the fact that in Iraq there is a problem between Iraqis themselves, Sunnis and Shiites fighting each other, and again, it being quite aggressive at times towards each other. And another example, and there are so many I could give, and that you could give, I'm sure, the violence in Northern Ireland over many, many years between the Catholics and the Protestants, these two Christian groups killing each other at times. Scientist Carl Sagan echoed Freud's idea about man being a wolf to man. Sagan put it somewhat differently. He talked about the reptilian core in human beings. And what's the reptilian core? Well, Sagan described it as that kernel of savagery in the brain left untouched by the process of evolution. Even the Dalai Lama, known to be a rather gentle human being who often talks about compassion, even the Dalai Lama has talked about the aggressiveness in man's nature. Here are the Dalai Lama's own words. "Aggression is an intimate part of ourselves. The most insane aggressiveness continues to live in the depths of us." The famous Dutch philosopher Spinoza also commented on this. Spinoza claimed that people are generally envious and more disposed to vengeance than to pity. Shakespeare also weighed in on this. One of his characters in Macbeth, one of his most famous plays, says the following: "In this earthly world, to do harm is often praised. To do good is often accounted dangerous folly." And Thoreau claimed that so often in this world, when people do good, Other people will call it doing evil. And what might be some examples of this? Abraham Lincoln might be the best example in American history. Lincoln, you recall, was assassinated. And why was he assassinated? Well, most of you know, Lincoln opposed the extension of slavery, and the man who assassinated him was a pro-slavery person. So Lincoln was assassinated, some would say, for his goodness. The fact that early on in his presidency, he called for a limit to the extension of slavery, and then later on, as you know, issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing most slaves in the United States. Some would also claim that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed for attempting to do good in this world. And what was Dr. King trying to do? Well, he was trying to secure the exercise of rights for black people in the same way whites were able to exercise their rights. That Martin Luther King Jr. was justifiably indignant that many black people were being prevented from voting in America. Many black people were consigned to a second-class citizenship, being segregated, for example, from white people in the southern part of the United States, not to mention the job discrimination they often faced. Martin Luther King Jr., in a nonviolent way, opposed all of this, tried to do good, tried to make the world a better place in which to live. And some would say he was killed because of his efforts to make the world a better place. Perhaps the best illustration of someone being punished for trying to do good is Jesus. Jesus preached a philosophy of love. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Indeed, he said that you would be able to recognize his followers by their capacity to love other people. And of course, Jesus, like Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., was killed. Should we be afraid of each other? After all, human beings tend to be aggressive, envious, and self-absorbed. Perhaps our salvation lies in our complexity. Yes, we may well have an instinct for aggression, but so many famous thinkers claim we also have an instinct for compassion. Indeed, the Buddhists claim that compassion is the best antidote to aggression. What are some recent examples of compassion which perhaps illustrate the idea that maybe we do have an instinct for compassion? Well, one could talk about the public response to 9/11, the fact that more people volunteered to help at the World Trade Center than actually could be used as volunteers, and that financial donations exceeded $1 billion. Also, even more recently, so many Americans and so many people in other advanced countries in the world attempted to come to the rescue of the Asian tsunami victims by donating huge amounts of money to help these people. Again, some indication of the compassion in human beings. Erich Hoffer, known by many as the longshoreman philosopher because he did work as a longshoreman in California for many years, he said that compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Let me give you the complete paragraph from which I've taken that sentence from Erich Hoffer. Mr. Hoffer said the following: compassion alone stands apart from the continuous traffic between good and evil proceeding within us. Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses in us remain relatively harmless. So yes, it is true, we human beings are capable of aggression, hatred, and much evil. But it's also true that we human beings are capable of compassion, love, and goodness. Again, proving how complicated we are. Let me give examples of some people who have cultivated the most positive traits in human nature. Saint Francis of Assisi, perhaps the most famous of Catholic saints, emphasized the idea that we should be more interested in loving other people than in being loved. And both Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. used nonviolence to try to make this world a more just place. They used nonviolence to try to fight injustice. And of course, Mother Teresa and Albert Schweitzer were both people who attempted over many, many years in different areas of the world to help the poorest of the poor. Mother Teresa did much of her work in aiding poor people in India, and Albert Schweitzer was a European medical doctor who spent more than 30 years in French Equatorial Africa treating, as a medical doctor, the poorest of the poor. And of course, other people who have cultivated the most positive of human traits are political dissidents. Political dissidents in many countries of the world, fighting totalitarianism, willing to go to jail, even die, to fight dictatorship in countries in which they live. They're trying to promote freedom in the countries in which they live, and are willing to sacrifice all to promote freedom, to promote democracy in countries that don't have it. Other people who have cultivated these positive traits are whistleblowers, corporate whistleblowers, among others, people who expose corruption in business, corruption which may affect all of us and hurt all of us, whether it's faulty products that they're manufacturing or financial indiscretions and even crimes that are being committed. And of course, as I speak, there are volunteers in so many countries of the world trying to assist poor people, trying to assist people living under the most despicable conditions. All of these people are human beings. How inspiring, how encouraging that, again, they are human beings and we are members of the same species as they are. I must tell you that many famous thinkers have had a rather negative view of human nature and our tendencies towards evil. And among the famous thinkers who have had a rather negative view are the following, and this is just a very short list. Aristotle, St. Augustine, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and Sigmund Freud. I mentioned last week, Freud described human beings as being wolves. He said man is a wolf to man. Among the outstanding dissenting voices to this negative view of human nature is the Dalai Lama. Yes, the Dalai Lama does concede that we are aggressive by nature, but he also adds this, and I'm quoting the Dalai Lama. He says, the foundations of human nature are gentleness and compassion. The foundations of human nature are gentleness and compassion. He goes on to say, and again I'm quoting him, if we examine human nature carefully, it is good, well-disposed, and helpful. How could Freud and the Dalai Lama disagree so much about human nature? Again, Freud having a very negative view of human nature, a very pessimistic view, and the Dalai Lama having a positive view, again saying the true foundations of human nature are gentleness and compassion. Well, I've thought about this. How is it possible that these two great thinkers, and I happen to believe that Freud was a great thinker and that the Dalai Lama is a great thinker, in thinking about their different responses to human nature, this is the conclusion I have come to. I think Freud was talking about how many, if not most people, behave. Whereas I think the Dalai Lama is talking about how the best of us behave. And he's talking about our potential. What the Dalai Lama is saying, I think, is that human nature is such that we all have the capacity, the potential to be gentle, compassionate, good, well-disposed, and helpful. So far, in talking about traits that might be common to most, if not all, human beings, I've talked about the idea that human beings tend to be desirous, fearful, complicated, aggressive, but capable of compassion, goodness, and love. Another characteristic I think it's fair to say we human beings share is that we all experience much unhappiness in life, even suffering, as well as happiness, of course. But let me zero in right now on the unhappiness we experience. Later, I'll get to the happiness. With regard to the unhappiness we experience, so much of it has to do with the anxiety and nervousness that we often experience, and fatigue, disappointment, the frustrations of daily living, injustice. I think it's fair to say that every human being at one time or another experiences unjust treatment at the hands of someone else. People experience sickness. We can be the victims of envy. All of these things can contribute to us being unhappy. Indeed, Thoreau put it this way. He said, dis-ease is the rule of our terrestrial life. Among the famous thinkers who have talked about human nature and our capacity for unhappiness are the following, and this is just a partial list. Buddha talked about the unhappiness we experience. In fact, the first noble truth of Buddhism, the foundation of the religion, is this sentence: life is suffering. But I must tell you that many people do not see Buddhism as a pessimistic religion. Yes, it starts with the premise that life is suffering, but then it goes on to teach us what we can do to alleviate our suffering and indeed to experience much joy and tranquility in living. St. Augustine, one of the most famous of Catholic saints, claimed we cannot hope to experience much happiness in this life, that happiness is reserved for those who achieve salvation. In other words, for those who go to heaven. The ancient Greeks, according to scholar H.D.F. Keto, the ancient Greeks believed the gods gave 2 sorrows for every 1 blessing. Shakespeare also weighed in on this. Hamlet, in the To Be or Not to Be monologue, says the following. He refers to, and I'm quoting him, the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. And the poet Longfellow said this: if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. And Thoreau, in a very famous sentence in Walden, his masterpiece, wrote the following: the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. The philosophers Schopenhauer and Russell both believed we experience so much unhappiness in life that we should regard our fellow human beings as fellow sufferers. Of course, the fact is that we not only experience unhappiness in life, we also experience happiness. And what are some of the examples, perhaps some of the causes of happiness? A gorgeous spring day, a child's lovely face, music. Indeed, Nietzsche said, life without music would be a mistake. Showing others affection, delicious food and drink, fighting for justice in the world, reading good books. Indeed, Professor Harold Bloom has said that reading is the most healing of pleasures. Wholesome sex can be a cause of happiness. And of course, memories. For example, the memories of elderly people who have tried to fight the good fight, who have tried to act decently in a world which is often very evil. And those elderly people can look back on a life well used. Those elderly people can take comfort in having tried to be decent human beings. It's often been said that life is made significant by the struggle and how we handle the struggle, whether we struggle with dignity or whether we sacrifice our dignity in the struggle. Another characteristic of human beings, so many of the famous thinkers have commented on, is that we human beings are easily distracted and we tend to live in the future and the past. Indeed, the Buddhists, in describing the nature of the mind, says the human mind is like a crazed monkey, a drunken crazed monkey cavorting about in a cage. The idea is it's often difficult for we human beings to concentrate on something, that our minds wander. Just try holding a particular thought in your mind at some time. Again, the ordinary mind, according to the Buddhists, is characterized by anxiety. This is the ordinary mind. Anxiety, anger, frustration, greed, spite, hatred, etc. The Buddha has said that our thoughts uncontrolled, can do us more harm than our worst enemy. Indeed, the Dalai Lama has said that the most important task for us in life is learning to tame our minds, learning to control our minds. I see I'm running short on time. Next week, I will spend most of the program dealing with a very scientific question, and that is, what is the role our genes and environment play in determining human nature? And I'll provide an historical analysis of this, and we'll also talk about what contemporary scientists are saying concerning the question of genes versus environment, nurture versus nature. Finally, I wish to remind all of us that Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."